I'm Sister Barbara Reed, President of Catholic Theological Union, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you tonight to this Shapiro lecture. As a New Testament scholar, I can hardly wait to hear what Dr. Wollenberg will say about the problem with the Bible and what early Christian reading habits taught the rabbis about the Hebrew Bible. But first, let's pause for a moment of prayer. Last week was the celebration of Purim, one of the most joyous Jewish holidays of the year. And this is the second week of Lent for Christians, a time of prayer, fasting, almsgiving, and repentance. Many consider this a somber time, but in fact, many of the prayers for the Lenten journey call it a joyful season. And so let us pray together, Jews, Christians, and people of all faiths and of no faith tradition. We ask our one God to fill our hearts with joy and praise, and with loving care for the most vulnerable in our midst. Give us a heart, dear God, of mercy like your own, and let us be ever joyful in your love. Amen. And now I'd like to ask Dr. Malka Zeiger-Simkovich to introduce our speaker.
My name is Malka Simkovich, and I am the Crown Ryan Chair of Jewish Studies and Director of Catholic Jewish Studies at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. I am delighted to welcome you all to this year's Winter Shapiro Lecture. This evening's event is one of 3 annual Shapiro Lectures, which, until this past fall, have always taken place in person. These events have offered residents of the Chicagoland community incredible opportunities to learn from world-class Jewish studies scholars in person and to gather together in an act of interreligious friendship and engagement. While we hope that next year will bring us back together in person, we also appreciate the silver lining of virtual learning, which invites us to expand our audience and invite all of you into the CTU learning community. I am thrilled to see that we have people tuning in tonight from all over the world to hear our featured speaker, Dr. Rebecca Wollenberg. Dr. Wollenberg is an assistant professor at the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, where she specializes in the history of Jewish biblical interpretation. Dr. Wollenberg is currently completing a book on how early rabbinic authorities thought about the written texts of the Bible as a form of revelation, which she will be completing with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Her work on the interrelationship between Jewish and Christian texts in late antiquity has won 2 very prestigious early career awards from the Society of Biblical Literature, the De Gruyter Prize and the David Noel Friedman Award. Please note that while this is a pre-recorded lecture, Dr. Wollenberg will be with us live throughout the event and will be available to answer some of your questions at the end of the hour. Feel free to post your questions in the chat box anytime throughout the lecture, and I will invite Dr. Wollenberg to address some of them at the end of her talk. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Rebecca Wollenberg.
This evening, I would like to tell you a surprising story about the early Jewish relationship with the Bible. According to this story, the early Jewish thinkers who founded rabbinic Judaism, that is, the thinkers who founded Judaism as we know it today, did not immediately embrace the biblical text as a source of religious knowledge when the Bible was first canonized. We know in hindsight, of course, that the Jewish community would eventually embrace the written text of the Bible as a keystone of Jewish religious culture. However, my research suggests that this biblical turn did not take place until the High Middle Ages, nearly a millennium after the canonization of the Bible. The work I'm going to tell you about today explores what happened in the intervening centuries, that is, from approximately 200 to 900 CE, a period in which the religious leaders of the Jewish people were deeply uneasy about the Bible and its status as a written document. Or, to put this in more colloquial terms, this evening I would like to tell you about why it took the rabbis nearly 1,000 years to learn to love the Bible. According to the current scholarly consensus, the Bible was canonized in the early centuries of the Common Era, at around the same time that the Jerusalem temple was destroyed by the Romans, and with it the cultic center of Judean religion. This confluence of events, we are told, would have significant consequences for the future of world Jewry, since the early Jewish authorities would grasp hold of the freshly canonized biblical text as an anchor for a new kind of Judaism that could survive in a world without Jerusalem at its center, a Judaism in which place and cult were replaced with text and exegesis. And thus, the story goes, at the dawn of the Common Era, the Jews were reborn as the people of the book. My own research tells a slightly different story. As I read the sources, the story actually went something like this. Around the beginning of the Common Era, Jewish practitioners became interested in fixing the text of the Hebrew Bible, so that the Bible did begin to circulate in this period as an increasingly cohesive written work. Almost immediately, a Jewish movement arose that would indeed place this new text at the center of its religious life. However, it was not the emerging Judaism of the rabbis, but a movement that would eventually become the family of religious communities that we know as Christianity. This movement would grow exponentially, taking on non-Jewish followers, and eventually achieve political rule over their Jewish compatriots. More important for our purposes this evening, this emerging religious community would interpret the written text of the Bible as a blueprint for their religious life, and cite the biblical text as evidence that Jews had been displaced as God's chosen people. According to the traditional narrative, rabbinic Jewry responded to these events by vigorously defending their own pre-existing claims on the Bible. And yet, I would argue that a careful consideration of early rabbinic traditions on the topic suggests quite the contrary, revealing instead that many early rabbinic thinkers withdrew from the written text of the Bible as their Christian interlocutors embraced it. The rabbis would not abandon their claims to the Sinaitic revelation, but they would retreat from the written text of the Bible as a source of communal danger and even a conduit for heresy. With that brief summary of the night's talk out of the way, I'd like to dig into a few of the details for those who are interested in the nitty-gritty of these ancient reading wars. So, what was it that pushed the early rabbinic authorities away from the written text of the Bible? Well, to begin with, when the spread of Christianity presented the world with a second biblical readership in the early centuries of the Common Era, early rabbinic thinkers discovered, to their chagrin, that written text has a tendency to be promiscuous. That is, with the rise of Christianity, Jewish thinkers were made forcefully aware that once the text is written down, it will speak to anyone who can decipher it. This quality is proving particularly problematic with regards to the biblical text, which so often addressed its audience in the second person plural, you all, y'all, so that anyone who engaged directly with biblical literature found themselves addressed collectively as Israel. That is, every reader found himself addressed as one of God's beloved children. Now, like most theoretical reflections in early rabbinic sources, classical rabbinic critiques of writing as a vehicle of divine revelation were posed primarily in narrative form. In other words, the early rabbis seldom waxed philosophical on a topic. Instead, they told you a story and left it up to you to discern the lesson. See, for instance, if you can read out the lesson in the following tale. Moses requested that the rabbinic law of the Mishnah be given in writing, but God foresaw that in the future the non-Jewish nations would translate the Bible and read it in Greek and would say, they are not Israel. God said to Moses, "Slow, Moses, in the future, the non-Jewish nations will say, we are Israel, we are the children of God. And Israel will say, we are the children of God. And thus far, the scales are balanced. But then God will say to the nations of the world, what do you mean you are my sons? I do not recognize any son but he who has my mysterion in his hand. That one is my son." And they will say to him, "And what is your mysterion?" He said to them, "This is the rabbinic law of the Mishnah." Now, the punchline of the story is that there is no full covenant between God and Israel without the secret mystery of the rabbinic oral law, or as it is known today, the oral Torah. But for our purposes, it isn't the punchline that is important. It is what comes before. In this story, both Jews and Christians possess the Bible. Through the authority of their Bibles, both Jews and Christians claim the title of Israel. And, this rabbinic text claims, thus far the scales are balanced. Christian claims to the biblical covenant are just as valid as Jewish ones. God himself worries that it is impossible to distinguish between the validity of these two claims to the sacred text. However these non-Jewish nations came by the biblical text, they have successfully appropriated its sacred promises. For the author of this passage, the rise of Christianity had revealed the biblical text as a problematic medium for a covenant between God and his chosen people, since, as the passage puts it using the Greek idiom, written text lacks the security of a mysterion, that is, a carefully guarded and controlled oral tradition. In other words, rabbinic stories like this one suggest that some early rabbinic thinkers, at least, saw how easy it was for their Christian compatriots to successfully use the Bible for their own religious purposes and began to ask questions. Why did their Hebrew Bibles suddenly give birth to new children? And why did these children read Revelation so differently from the rabbis? What could this development teach the Jewish community about sacred text and its risks? With the greatest respect to portrayals of Justin Martyr, early rabbinic thinkers do not appear to have attributed this success to the savviness of early Christian biblical interpreters. On the contrary, early rabbinic narratives often express great impatience at what they perceive as the tendentiousness and superficiality in the reading practices of their Christian interlocutors. In the Jerusalem Talmud, in Tractate Brachot, for instance, Rabbi Simlai complains that every time the heretics start breaking up a verse to prove a point, their answer is right there beside them. And while he is bemoaning this tendency to take textual evidence out of context, a group of Christians suddenly appear. Didn't I tell you that rabbis always prefer a good story to a long speech? These Christians say, what about this place in Genesis where it is written, "Let us make man in our image and our likeness"? Now, doesn't that sound like the Trinity? Rabbi Simlai replies, but it isn't then written, "They made man in their image," but "God created man in his image," with a singular verb, which shows that it is a royal we. And they were apparently satisfied with this explanation and went away. But no sooner had they gone than they came back, saying, but what about that place in Joshua 22:22, where it is written, "Lord divine God, he knows," with 3 divine names, just like the Trinity? He said to them, but here too, "they know" isn't written with a plural verb, but "he knows" in the singular. And the passage just goes on and on like this, as they go and come back and go and come back, bringing verse after verse of apparently plural nouns attached to singular verbs. Now, as a matter of fact, many of these verses would make lovely proof texts for Trinitarian theology. A plural divine noun attached to a singular verb is a great jumping off point for thinking about a Godhead that is simultaneously plural and unified. And indeed, the rabbis may have gathered these particular proof texts from such a source. But that doesn't matter for our purposes, because from the rabbinic perspective, this Christian inability to wait until one has read the verb in a sentence represents bad reading technique. In other words, In rabbinic stories like these, early Christian biblical interpreters are not imagined as sophisticated scholarly rivals. They are envisioned with some affection and a great deal of impatience as enthusiastic and well-read neophytes, consuming the Hebrew Bible without fully understanding its rules of engagement. According to this school of thought, Christian Bible readers may also be God's children now, but they are the new kids on the block and will apparently need some time to acclimate. So, if the undeniable success of Christianity in appropriating the Hebrew Bible was not a sophisticated exegetical coup, according to the rabbis, then what did these early rabbinic thinkers imagine was going on? I would argue that many late antique Jewish thinkers came to blame the state of affairs that they witnessed on the nature of the biblical text itself. Or to put it another way, with the rise of Christianity, the rabbis would discover that a written deed to the covenant was a transferable deed to the covenant. And as Christianity came into its own as a political force, many rabbinic sages would begin to reflect that a transferable deed to the covenant between God and his chosen people might be a very dangerous sort of document. We see this anxiety expressed, for instance, in a story from the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Sanhedrin, in which a series of Gentile nations are imagined as appearing before Alexander the Great and presenting the text of the Bible as their written title to the land of Israel. Each of these stories follows the same basic pattern, so I've only included one example here. The progeny of Abraham's oldest son, Ishmael, and the sons of Abraham's second wife, Keturah, came to dispute with the people of Israel before Alexander the Great and said to him, "The land of Canaan, that is Israel, is ours and theirs. As it is written, and these are the generations of Ishmael, and these are the generations of Isaac, as if they were equal." Gaviha ben Basisa said to the sages, "Give me permission and I'll go dispute with them before Alexander the Great. If they're victorious over me, say, 'You just conquered the layman.' But if I triumph over them, say to them, 'It was the Torah of Moses our teacher that conquered you.'" He said to them, "From where do you bring proof?" And they said, "From the Bible." He said, "Well, then I too will not bring any proof except from the Bible. Here is my proof. Abraham gave all that was his to Isaac and to the sons of Abraham's concubines. A father who gave legacies to his children during his lifetime and then sent one away from the other one. This one is nothing at all coming to him from that one." Like the first narrative we discussed, this narrative amplifies the concerns expressed in our first story regarding the transferable nature of written documents by representing the biblical text as a literal deed to the land of Israel, and suggesting that anyone who can lay hands on that deed might appropriate it as evidence of ownership. This passage also adds a new charge to the rabbinic list of objections to writing as a sacred medium. It suggests that as a fixed and limited message, written text is particularly vulnerable to misinterpretation. Indeed, the drama of this narrative rests on the fact that each of the false claims made against Israel on the basis of the biblical text is seductively plausible, and thus poses a very real danger to the rights of the Jewish people. This text also expresses discomfort with the aura of authority and completeness that written words take on in some cultural contexts. For once the opponents of Israel have taken up the written text of the Bible as a source of authoritative knowledge, it quickly becomes the only source from which one can bring proof in this argument. As this passage puts it, one is forced to argue from the limited formula of the written text alone, or run away from that dispute. Like the first narrative we discussed, this is the story of a supersessionist maneuver that failed. And yet, even this optimistic narrative vividly captures the anxieties that began to adhere to the biblical text for some rabbinic thinkers in a global political environment in which the written text of the Bible was increasingly treated as a binding and self-evident document that others could examine to judge the value of Jewish beliefs and determine the political rights of the Jewish people. Nor does the story really have a happy ending. Each individual episode concludes successfully, but as one nation replaces another in the struggle to lay claim to Israel's birthrights, the quick succession of contenders generates an atmosphere of siege. It seems that the nations will continue their attempts to appropriate Israel's birthright as long as the biblical text is available to them. And when one reflects on how close each of these failed contenders came to winning their case in this narrative, a listener cannot help but wonder if one day one of these claimants will succeed in using the biblical text to supplant the Jewish people. In some of these rabbinic stories about the failures of the biblical text, Christian Bible readers continue to be the focus of the conversation. This theme comes to the fore in a particularly vivid way, for instance, in later rabbinic stories about the production of the Septuagint, that is, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. In the earliest rabbinic versions of this story, we are simply told that the sages changed 13 things when they translated the Bible into Greek for King Ptolemy. And we are then given a list of the secret changes inserted into the Greek translation. Now, already at this point, the story is premised on the notion that the plain text of the Hebrew Bible might be dangerously obscure or even misleading, particularly in the hands of outsiders. So steps must be taken to guard against biblical misreading. But the theme of textual obscurity really comes into its own in later versions of the story, when rabbinic thinkers begin to parody Christian versions of the tale. Now, this is where the going gets hard, because I'm going to ask you to read a version of this story by the early Christian author Eusebius, and then remember it while we read a pretty subtle rabbinic parody of that early Christian narrative, or at least a narrative very like that one. That is, I'm going to show you this particular passage, not to suggest that the rabbis had read this exact story, which Eusebius attributes to the scholar Irenaeus, but rather to suggest that later rabbinic versions of the Septuagint story were parodying early Christian versions of the same story that were very like the one you're about to read. Ptolemy was eager to establish the library he had founded at Alexandria with all the finest writings from everywhere, so he asked the people of Jerusalem to have their scriptures translated into Greek. Being still subject to the Macedonians at the time, they sent him 70 elders, the most competent they had in scripture and in both languages, thus fulfilling God's purpose. Fearing that these rabbis might conspire to conceal in their translation the true meaning of scriptures, Ptolemy separated them from each other and ordered them all to write out the same translation of each of the books. When they reconvened before Ptolemy and compared their separate versions, God was glorified and scriptures were recognized as truly divine because they all said exactly the same things in exactly the same words and phrases from beginning to end, so that even the heathen who were present knew that scripture had been translated with the inspiration of God. Now, none of the early versions of the Jewish Septuagint had mentioned a miraculous convergence of translations. The miraculous nature of the Septuagint translation is, however, an important motif in early Christian versions of the story, such as this one. For Irenaeus and Eusebius, the miracle of the Septuagint was that the Hebrew text was translated with perfect accuracy, even though a pagan ruler conspired to confound the translators. The quality attributed to a truly divine written text by these early Christian authors was that it conveyed its meaning with perfect accuracy, always loyal to the truth of the message the divine author sought to convey. Rabbinic versions of this tale will adopt these same narrative motifs, Ptolemy's trick, and a miracle in which multiple translations composed independently nevertheless turn out to be identical. But the rabbinic narratives will recode these elements to produce a very different lesson about the biblical text and its reliability, as we see, for instance, in a version of this story from Sofrim 1:7. A story about the elders that wrote the Torah in Greek for Ptolemy the king. That day was as harsh for Israel as the day on which the golden calf was made, because the Torah couldn't all be translated appropriately. King Ptolemy brought 72 elders and set them in 72 separate houses, and he did not reveal to them for what purpose he had brought them. He brought in each of them one by one and said to them, "Write for me the Torah of Moses, your master." But God put a hint into the heart of each, and their minds agreed as one mind, and they each wrote for him the Torah and changed 13 things in it. They wrote, "God created in the beginning," and God said, "I will make man in my image and likeness." And he finished on the 6th day and rested on the 7th, and so forth. The rabbinic authors of the story have reworked the old rabbinic Septuagint tradition to incorporate 2 new narrative motifs unique to early Christian versions of the story. But this is not an instance in which imitation is the best form of flattery, because our rabbinic authors have turned these novel motifs completely on their head. Indeed, rabbinic versions of the tale might even be called a parody of early Christian stories. Here, the miracle of the Septuagint is not that the translations which these various sages produced were miraculously identical with the original Hebrew text, but quite the opposite. The miracle is that the sages were able to successfully put one over on a powerful and tricky reader by changing the text right under his nose. And that was possible because God was willing to help them make the text even more misleading than it already was. In this version of the tale, divine intervention does not ensure that the translated text accurately reflects the pristine original. Instead, God intervenes to ensure that the text miraculously obscures the original thought and wording of the author from unauthorized readers. Now, at its most basic level, this story claims that Christian Bible readers disputed rabbinic understandings of the Bible because they were being misled by the innate obscurity of written text, misled by Hebrew cleverness, misled by God himself. But at a more abstract level, this rabbinic story offers up a more general and disturbing image of the biblical text as a deeply inaccurate representation of the divine will. First, it suggests that the original Hebrew text was already dangerously open to misinterpretation. In fact, the text was so misleading on its own that it could not be safely transmitted to outsiders in its actual form. Second, the story insists that what marks the Greek translation of the Bible as divinely inspired is precisely that it had been made inaccurate through the divine Spirit. According to this tradition, then, even the very best of sacred texts are not crystal clear mirrors of the divine author's mind. For like all written texts, a written revelation represents an always unclear and occasionally sneaky projection of the divine author's intentions. A written text is simply, by its very nature, an inherently untruthful form of communication, according to the school of thought. We find a particularly rich vein of such reflections, for instance, in classical rabbinic traditions about the 2 sets of tablets that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus. For those of you who aren't familiar with this story, according to the book of Exodus, the biblical revelation was actually given twice. The first time Moses received the Sinaitic revelation, he left the people standing at the bottom of Mount Sinai, ascended the mountain, and was given 2 stone tablets on which God himself inscribed the revelation with his own divine finger, whatever that means. At which point, Moses headed back down the mountain to share this revelation with the people. But as he approached the camp, Moses discovered that while he was communing with God on the mountain, the people had built themselves an idol, a golden calf. and they were dancing around this idol when Moses arrived, carrying the 2 tablets inscribed with the new revelation. When Moses saw this, he threw down the tablets in disgust, and they shattered. And that was the end of the first tablets as a written text. Moses would eventually go back up the mountain and collect a replacement set of tablets. Only when Moses got to the top of the mountain the second time, God announced that Moses would have to write the second set of tablets himself. And in the classical rabbinic imaginary, it was this second set of tablets, written in Moses' own hand, that represented the Bible that was bequeathed to history. And here is where I need you to take a bit of a left turn with me, because the contrast between these 2 versions of the revelation, the first written by God in a moment of hope, and the second written by Moses during a period of estrangement between God and Israel, these versions of the revelation would become a locus for early Christian critiques of the Old Testament and the nature of the Jewish covenant in general, as Irenaeus contrasts the contents of the second tablet to those of the first tablet. Now at first, God gave them natural precepts, that is, the 10 Commandments, which one cannot be saved without observing, and demanded nothing more than these. But when they turned their back on him to make a calf, and their souls reverted to Egypt, longing to be enslaved instead of free, their desire was attained by receiving slavery through a new revelation, which at least did not cut them off from God completely, although it enslaved them in hard bondage. In this rendering of the 2 revelation narrative, the first revelation at Sinai was a life-giving revelation that would have bound the people of Israel to God with simple, natural precepts. The second tablets, in contrast, represented a revelation devoid of life-giving sacrality, which even the prophets of Israel recognized were not good. Indeed, the nature of the second revelation was so problematic that the form of religious life it outlined was understood to represent a form of punishment, a ritualistic enslavement designed to control and chastise a community unprepared to be free. As we see in parallel sources that offer more detailed descriptions of the second revelation, the text in question was often understood to be the extant text of the Bible, or Old Testament, a document replete with purity laws and sacrifices, divorce, and other institutions that were understood to stand in contradiction to spiritual truth. All that could really be said in favor of this document, these early Christian thinkers suggested, is that it was a compassionate compromise that served to spiritually distance a corrupt people from the divine rather than completely cutting them off from God. One would think that the early rabbinic thinkers would reject this characterization of the Hebrew Bible, but sources such as the Tosefta and Tractate Bava Kama apparently embrace this image of the Hebrew Bible as an enslaving decree. I won't walk you through all the complicated bits about the people's biblical enslavement to God in that text, but I will share with you the parable that this rabbinic text used to explain and soften the idea that the Hebrew Bible represented a divorce decree between God and Israel. As the Tosefta puts it, what does it mean to say that the first tablets were inscribed with the finger of God, but the second tablets were written by Moses? This can be allegorized as the story of a king who married a common woman. When he first married her, he was proud to bring his own scribe and writing materials to write out her marriage contract with honor. This royal document is the first tablets written by God. But when this woman did something wrong by committing a sexual indiscretion, at that point, the king made her provide the scribe and the writing materials to write out the divorce decree that would release her from the marriage, and thus the penalty of death hanging over her head for adultery. As far as the angry husband was concerned, it was more than enough that he appended his signature to the document. And this second, ordinary document, written in a moment of estrangement, represents the second tablets written by Moses, a metonymy for the Bible as we know it. In other words, this rabbinic story agrees with early Christian critics and opines that the text of the Hebrew Bible as we know it is indeed a very far cry from the intimate glimpse into the mind of God, but is instead a text that holds its reader at arm's length, keeping those who cannot withstand the fire safely out in the cold. So how did the rabbis reconcile the official status of the Bible as a central religious document with their own doubts concerning the value of the biblical text? In a system of reading and writing practices similar to our own, in which meaning is conveyed by a text, is taken to derive from the written signs on a page, such ambivalence towards biblical text might well have led to a rejection of the biblical revelation itself. However, the rabbis did not read like us, and this ultimately provided a solution to their conundrum. My research suggests that early rabbinic reading practices had already rendered the written transcript of the biblical revelation a peripheral and often irrelevant facet of the biblical tradition in daily life for many practitioners, a fact which in turn rendered the doubts about the text's value less urgent for those late antique practitioners. Let me show you what I mean. In this period, Biblical Hebrew was written as a consonantal writing system without vowels. Now, as we know from modern Hebrew, there are, of course, many ways to read a consonantal writing system. According to the dominant classical rabbinic reading practice, however, one read an unvocalized biblical text by memorizing an oral formula that corresponded to that text and reciting it from memory. I've created an English mock-up here to give you a sense of how the system functioned. This recitation could be performed in conjunction with a consonantal text, but the presence of a written text was not actually a necessary component of the reading process. That is, a memorized biblical formula might be read without immediate reference to a written text at all, and still constitute reading in the rabbinic imagination. Indeed, many early rabbinic descriptions of reading suggest that the practice they envisioned was not essentially dependent upon text at all. Biblical passages included in the daily liturgical readings, known as the Shema passages, for instance, are almost always depicted in early rabbinic traditions as formulas read from memory in the absence of a written text, a practice called reading by heart in early rabbinic sources. Indeed, early rabbinic authorities almost seem to take a perverse pleasure in imagining practitioners reading these daily readings in a situation in which a person would be exceedingly unlikely to have access to a written text, in this period or really any other. Early rabbinic traditions imagined, for instance, that a man who suddenly remembered that he needed to read the Shema passages while he was visiting a ritual immersion pool might read these verses while immersed up to his neck in water, that a person might read with a shirt pulled over his head, or that a harvester who had taken off all of his clothes to work, for some reason, that part's not really clarified, might cover his naughty bits with straw and read standing in the field. Nor is this phenomenon unique to well-known liturgical readings. Classical rabbinic traditions are replete with descriptions of reading that forcefully remind us that to read in the rabbinic context always meant to recite from memory, whether one did so in conjunction with a written text or not. The formulators of Genesis Rabbah, for example, and late antique rabbinic midrash, or homiletic exegesis of the Bible, imagine a situation, for example, in which one might read a text before it had been written down, since they warned their audiences not to read a biblical text from memory and write it out. The rabbis of the Babylonian Talmud did not hesitate to offer advice that would be meaningless in the context of our own literacy practices. That passage should be read as it is written. Nor did they see a contradiction in declarations such as, the book of Esther was formulated to be read, but not to be written. Such statements clearly equate the fixity of reading and the stability of writing. the two practices are often treated as parallel and sometimes interchangeable, but these declarations appear paradoxical in the context of modern Western practices of literacy because their authors do not understand reading to always derive from writing, but instead imagine that writing may sometimes follow reading, or that reading might occur quite separately from writing. Other classical rabbinic traditions suggest that the written consonantal text had already become a superfluous witness to the Sinaitic revelation in many rabbinic circles, and that even the minimal formal correlation that the rabbis sought to enforce between the oral formula and the written consonantal text had already become something of a threadbare legal fiction. To return to Genesis Rabbah again, for instance, it relates a story, an almost humorous narrative, about the elaborate formalistic procedures that the great scribe Rabbi Meir went through in order to produce a rabbinically approved liturgical reading for one congregation. Here's how Genesis Rabbah tells this story. When Rabbi Meir arrived in the town, he discovered that they did not possess a written copy of the Scroll of Esther, which is read on the holiday of Purim. Now, like most of his colleagues, Rabbi Meir knew the entire text of Esther by heart and could easily have recited the reading from memory. But Rabbi Meir was also a scribe, which meant that unlike many of his colleagues, he also possessed the ability to write down the entire book of Esther. Therefore, in order to honor the rabbinic ruling that forbid practitioners to read a lectionary from memory for the public, Rabbi Meir first sat down, recited the memorized oral formula of Esther to himself, and wrote out what he recited. Sadly, this practice too had been forbidden by the rabbis, who warned scribes not to write out biblical books from memory, presumably to help protect their accuracy. So the diligent rabbi sat down and wrote out a second scroll, which he then dutifully copied from the first scroll, which he had just composed from memory. Now I'm losing track. And then he used the second scroll to read from as he recited the memorized oral formula of Esther from memory. Did you follow that? While the formulator of this tradition applauds Rabbi Meir for his careful, if slightly technical, adherence to the rabbinic rulings on this matter, the convoluted procedures Rabbi Meir goes through to fulfill his obligation only serves to highlight the essential fact of the matter. There was only one copy of the Book of Esther in this remote town, and it existed in Rabbi Meir's head. And herein lay the rabbinic answer to the problem posed by the insufficiencies perceived in the biblical text. For many early rabbinic thinkers, the biblical revelation did not reside in the written consonantal transcript of the biblical revelation, but in the more fluid oral formulas of the biblical tradition that were circulating in the memories and mouths of its adherents. That is, in many early rabbinic circles, the memorized oral formulas of the biblical tradition came to be thought of as the speaking text of the Bible, the true heir to the Sinaitic revelation, and the medium through which God expressed his divine will to his people. In what sense was this memorized oral formula perceived to be an echo of God's voice in a way that the written text was not? On a formal level, this problem can be solved by returning to the story of the two tablets. For several early rabbinic traditions relate that when the first tablets of the law were broken and the original, more perfect biblical revelation escaped from the tablets, the contents of the revelation did not simply disappear, but were transformed back into their original, more natural form as divine speech. In other words, these narratives maintain that the first revelation was not actually lost to posterity when the first tablets were shattered. Rather, according to this account, both versions of the biblical revelation were given to the Jewish people, only in slightly different forms. The second, less satisfactory version of the biblical tradition was presented as the written consonantal text of the Bible, and the first, more authentic iteration of the biblical revelation was conveyed as the recited oral formula of the biblical text, an oral Bible, if you will, a sort of biblical counterpart to the oral tradition of rabbinic learning that we know as the oral Torah. On a more practical level, of course, one might ask what early rabbinic thinkers actually gained from this substitution. Wouldn't a fixed oral formula function very similarly to a written text in communal life? My research suggests, however, that we must fundamentally reconceptualize the shape that the biblical tradition took in the lived experience of practitioners who engaged with the Bible primarily as a series of memorized oral formulas. In daily practice, these memorized biblical traditions did not function as a discrete text, but were inextricably woven into a broader matrix of memorized oral traditions that define classical rabbinic culture. In the process, the boundaries of the biblical tradition became less defined, its formulas less fixed, and the meaning of any given biblical passage more changeable and evanescent. And many early rabbinic thinkers would come to embrace this culturally embedded oral echo of the biblical tradition as a more authentic witness to the biblical revelation, a better Bible, which transcended the fixity and narrowness and fragility that had apparently made the written transcript of the Bible in the hands of Christian readers so dangerous to the rabbinic project. So to sum up, whether early rabbinic thinkers would have come to valorize the textuality of biblical writings if they had been left to their own devices, we will never know. For with the growth of a rival biblical community into the movement we know as Christianity, many early rabbinic authorities would remark upon the fact that this quickly expanding so-called heresy was being fed by the availability of a written transcript of the biblical tradition. And they would begin to question whether the circulation of revelation in written form was perhaps a practice too dangerous to be sustained. However, this burgeoning rabbinic anxiety concerning sacred writing would not lead them to guard and treasure their sacred texts as the exclusive possession of a literate elite, but would instead inspire growing suspicion and distaste for the written text among the elite themselves, who would begin to question how so coarse and limited a mode of communication could possibly be thought to adequately capture the will of a transcendent infinite being. At which point, existing rabbinic practices would take on new ideological value, and the memorized vocal formula of the biblical tradition would be embraced as an appropriately intangible and multifaceted echo of the voice of God, the true heir to the biblical revelation, while the consonantal transcript of the biblical writings recorded in parchment scrolls would be recoded as a problematic ritual object that must be formally honored as a sort of material memorial to the biblical revelation, but which no longer functioned as a communicative object in rabbinic circles, but was instead left to those that loved it best, the rabbi's Christian neighbors.